Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome, friend, to Delingpole, the podcast with me, your lovely host, James Delingpole, brought to you by Breitbart. And I am so excited about my special guest this week. I know I'm always excited about my special guest, but in this case, I have got for you, for your delectation, an actual mathematician. Now, we don't get many mathematicians on the show, and he's not just a mathematician, he's an uber mathematician. He is a professor of applied mathematics at, where are you?
University of Western Ontario.
University of Western
Sometimes
Ontario.
Called Western University, but that's not the official name.
His name is Professor Dr. Christopher Essex, and I've been having coffee with him, and we've covered so many subjects, and unfortunately we've probably now killed them all for the podcast, but we're going to have a go. Christopher, you've just been talking at the Global Warming Policy Foundation.
Yes.
In the House of Lords.
Well, yeah, that's kind of an interesting story. You know, you went and decided you were going to have an election, and they prorogued Parliament, and so the place is shut down. So they moved us off of.
You weren't allowed in.
Yeah, so we just had a nearby venue, and we did the same thing. So, but I thought it was kind of interesting to to be displaced by being prorogued. I think that's cool.
I think people can probably guess which side of the climate skepticism argument you're on.
Here's where I come out and tell you that I support the conventional thinking on it.
Yeah.
I think you're all wrong.
That would be a great shock, wouldn't it?
Yes. And then of course I'll become lionized in the press, and then vast amounts of resources and money will start flowing into my coffers as a result.
It is one of the frequent complaints on this podcast. Mm-hmm. If only I were on the other side, I'd be jetting all over the world, and so would you. Well, you do anyway, but we would be jetting even more over the world in lovely.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very attractive. Actually.
Bali.
Yeah.
What was Addis Ababa? I think is the next one.
I don't know.
I quite like Addis Ababa.
You do?
Well, Ethiopia's got a lot. Interesting stuff going for it.
Yeah, I personally hate travel. I mean, I don't mind being there and meeting people and so forth, but there's the traveling part. It's
So when they sort out these special teleportation
that would be better.
Devices, well, you're a mathematician. Isn't that the kind of shit that mathematicians can?
Well, see, the thing is that I already can travel pretty far anyway. I mean, I regularly conduct tours of Hilbert space, so I don't really need to travel around on Earth. I can go much further.
So tell me about how long you've
Dress
been
warmly and pack a lunch.
Well, you're Canadian, aren't you? I mean, you have to.
No, I'm talking about in Hilbert space.
Oh, I see. Tell me how long you've been a climate skeptic.
Since the 1970s.
You don't look that old. How old are you?
Old enough.
Older than
I
you
have
look.
5 grandchildren.
Yeah, you do. You look young.
Yeah, well, thank you. I don't know how long it'll last.
Obviously, on radio you can't see that.
I've earned all my grey hairs.
Right, okay.
Yes.
But, so you've been a climate skeptic since the 1970s.
Yes, I was tasked to build a climate model, and I found out what's in them, and I can assure you that if you knew what was in them, you would be a skeptic too.
Is it puppy dog's tails and snails and...
yeah, something along those lines, There's a lot of wobbly bits.
Can I just guess that I'm imagining that I am a true believer in global warming.
That's hard for you, isn't it?
No, but yeah, it is. No, because I read English literature. I'm good on the imagination stuff.
I see.
That's my domain.
It's a little bit of a challenge, I think.
Well,
okay.
I'm just imagining for a moment that I am a true believer, and I think that their response would be, well, okay, he's a professor of maths. Hello, maths is about sums and stuff. What does he know about climate science? You need a climate scientist to tell us about climate science.
Yeah, who is that? What exactly is climate science? I haven't figured that out.
Well, I think probably 97% of the public imagine that there are these things called climate scientists, and they know.
Well, there was this thing called climatology many years ago that was quite resident in places like geography departments, where people would be descriptive about what the meteorology was in a particular geographical zone and so forth. And that was the extent that people really developed the idea of climate in the past. And then, of course, there's meteorology, which is quite soundly based on things like fluid mechanics and radiative transfer and thermodynamics and so forth. So, but it wasn't really climatology. And then, of course, you have the paleoclimatology types who work and they look at past climates and rocks.
Bristlecone pines and things.
Well, and even further back, actual real rock strata and so forth. So that's where you really would see the notion of climate change in a real sense. But the actual art of connecting our everyday experience to these things is a huge scientific challenge. And then, of course, you have other fields. You have statisticians who do time series analysis and so on, and they take data and they analyze the data using statistical methods and make forecasts and so on. And you take all of these fields and many, many more, and you kind of put them in a big pot, and then someone decided to call that climate science. And I think it really only has a unified content from a sort of technical scientific sense, with the agenda of achieving some kind of policy objective. So it really isn't a science-driven thing with a well-defined topic, collection of materials to study, and so on. So it's something that's kind of a modern construction, kind of like a Frankenstein's monster of fields that's been assembled together. So I'm not really sure what climate science as a whole is, because the problem is that there is really no physically based theory for climate, or even definition for climate. And that's something I've been thinking a lot about. And there's not any way, therefore, to talk about what it means to change when you're not sure what it is to begin with. Because you can certainly see change going on meteorologically every day, but that's not climate. So,
but how, as a mathematician, are you able to contribute valid things to the debate? I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Oh, you do that well. You have this sort of demonic look on your face.
Yeah,
that's right. It's okay. With the problem is that, of course, I'm in an applied mathematics department, which means that I used to run the theoretical physics program there, and so I have a lot of background in physics. And I built climate models myself in the 1970s, and I've been attached to the General Circulation Modeling Group at the Canadian Climate Centre in the 1980s, and so I know what's in these models, and I know the physics. And so I think that qualifies me as much as anybody.
Yeah, and models, after all, are at the heart of all the kind of scare stories that we hear from the IPCC and so on.
Well, yeah, it's put up as a kind of a prop, because if you put up something kind of inscrutable, they don't really know what's in it, then you can tell people whatever you want them to believe is in it. You can say that's what's in it, and so if people don't know, they can be quite frightened if the correct words are used.
So what they're doing, I suppose, is play. The analogy I would use is in the Middle Ages, before the Bible was translated into the vernacular, and before printing made books widely available. The priests were the gatekeepers, were they not, of the religion? So everything had to go through the priests. Everything had to be mediated through the priests. And in the same way, I think with modern science, with climate science particularly, we've got this cast of supposed experts who are supposed to be the gatekeepers to all the knowledge, and the ordinary members of the public are expected to just take what they say as read. This is what the models say. This is what's going to happen to climate, more or less. Trust us. Therefore, your public policy should be based on that.
I think that's an analogy. I prefer the one that's a little bit more primitive, but it works more or less the same way. I mean, the idea of the shaman speaking for the gods. According to that machinery, then someone like Al Gore would be a shaman. It's sort of this godly religion that's inscrutable, that you can't know about, can't be discussed. It can only be followed. So I think there's a kind of aspect to it.
And the shaman get rewarded with special privileges, don't they? For example, if you're a climate shaman, you get to have a waterside property with loads and loads of lights in it, like Al Gore has, and I think like a lot of them, because you are immune to the effects of climate change, which you nevertheless preach all the time.
I'm one of those people who has a lot of faith in the intelligence of the average human being, and I think I know a lot of people who feel otherwise. But I've met lots of people, and when you give them a chance, they're really quite capable and quite smart. But if you kind of frighten them and bully them and intimidate them and so forth, a lot of the times it's hard for that to show, for that to shine. And if you have these kind of middlemen telling you what's going on, these middlemen can take you or take people in any direction they want. They can just say, well, these authorities said this or that, and
that's
end up
interesting. You say that. I've just read a long essay by Richard Lindzen, who you must know very well.
Yeah, I know Dick.
Professor of
meteorology
at MIT,
Mm-hmm.
And he's a physicist. And you've got a physics background yourself. And he was saying that he often goes and lectures audiences, and he talks to them about the science, and he talks to them about things like probability and about looks at the temperatures and says, well, hang on a second, how do we know what is natural and what is man-made? And if you look at the graphs, actually the temperature swings are quite similar. Before there could have been any significant anthropogenic input. So he talks about all this stuff and says what he comes up against is the brick wall of people's propagandized assumptions, like the 97% figure, like the polar bears are drowning figure, like the ice caps are melting meme. And he says he finds it very difficult to get past that. So what would your response to that be?
That it's difficult to get past that, or how do I get past it?
Well, first of all, do you agree that it's difficult to get past that stuff? And secondly, how do we get past it?
It's for some people. Look, there are different. People are complicated, and there's lots of different thoughts going on. And there are some people who find it. You can sit and talk to them, and they say, "Oh, yeah, that's a good point," and then they take it. There are other people that it doesn't matter what you say, and it's not going to make any difference. And when you have a really good social fervor going, it's really hard to get people to stop. It's a little bit like standing in front of the crowd going to want to burn a witch or something. It's just try not to get burnt yourself.
It is like that, isn't it?
It's a bit like that.
It's the madness of crowds. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's groupthink.
Yeah,
it's a religion.
Well, the problem is there are lots of people who are skeptical about it, but they are kind of afraid to say anything about it. And there's this phenomenon that a sociologist told me about some time ago called pluralistic ignorance, where something that is in a position that's widely held, people are not aware that others hold that opinion. And so they think they're the only one, and so they kind of keep quiet, and so does everybody else. And so there's this kind of general quietness on a position that is actually widely held. And I think a lot of people are quite skeptical about the shaman approach to this stuff, and they're starting to smell a rat in a way. So I think that the madness of crowds is not really quite so uniform as we might think. And I think, once again, if you give people a chance, I think that they will come through, and they'll surprise you all.
Except there are certain people who, for example, I was in Positano the other day. I got this rather good trip to Positano.
No.
On the Amalfi coast of Italy. It's this lovely, lovely.
Okay. Lovely Italy.
Built on the side of a cliff by the sea, and it's very, very lovely. Mm-hmm. And staying in my very ritzy hotel was this woman whose husband was a skin specialist or something. She came from Boston, mm-hmm. and I knew at once that she was a liberal. Mm-hmm. She was going to be a rich liberal, Democrat voter through and through. And I was talking to her on this walk we went on, and we both clearly loved walking and both clearly loved nature. And that was a thing we had in common. Mm-hmm. But I also knew that if we talked about politics, there would be this massive gulf between us. And I asked her about Trump and I asked about this and that. But the thing that really, really bothered her was climate change. And she was passionate about it. And she was passionate about the terrible damage we were doing to the environment. Naturally, I didn't give away my position. But I thought, you're a nice-ish woman, that we have a lot in common on many things. We both care about nature. And yet, you have been living in this bubble where you get all your information from the New York Times, National Public Radio, probably. You probably read...
No, it just makes me cringe.
Well, she probably reads Nature. She probably watches CNN, gets all her fake news from CNN. Do you not think that there is a problem where you've got this massive gulf between those of us who read sites like Breitbart and those who exist in the liberal bubble, which has a completely different view of climate change?
Well, I think all of us are in bubbles to some extent or another. I think the real question is...
Yeah, but we're in a truth bubble.
Yeah, well, that might be true in some sense, but you have to be a little bit humble about it. I mean... not too humble. I mean, it'll be a little bit. Yeah, you don't have to be humble entirely.
I don't think we need to be humble, Christopher. I really don't.
Oh, you don't?
I think we're very, very clever fellows.
Yeah, I can take that.
Humility is for the little people.
Okay. Well, all right. No,
Carry on.
But my position about the bubbles is that it's the human condition to always be not understand something. And I think if you go through, if there's one big lesson from the history of science is that we get things wrong over and over and over again, and we gradually, generation upon generation, chip away at it and get a little better at things and so on. And if you're too closed-minded about things, then things can go wrong. But the problem is that we're dealing with people who are completely closed-minded about things, and they're not prepared to actually have a dialogue. They see you as an opponent to be defeated, rather than another fallible human being that you try to figure out together what the truth is. No, they see you someone just to be destroyed and crushed. Absolutely. I mean, that's the part that I find intolerable.
I think we should develop this in the next section. Actually, this what's going on right now is kind of against all the principles of the scientific method, is it not?
Well, I know there's some effort to push the idea of the scientific method. I have some issues with that, but yes, it is contrary to how science works. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can agree on that. You are listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, your special friend James Delingpole, and my special guest, Dr. Christopher Essex, applied mathematician from the University of Western Ontario. He's Canadian, don't you know? More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Let's get Bo Dietl in on the conversation.
We must stop the immigration until we're effectively able to know who's coming into our country and why you come to America. Do you love our freedom? Well, if that's the reason why you come to America and you want to be part of us, welcome aboard. If you want to come to America and disrupt the freedom and the great country that we have, you stay the hell out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to Delingpole, the podcast with me, your lovely, nice friend, James Delingpole, and my special guest, Dr. Christopher Essex. There is a town in Ontario. Did you get my impersonation there?
No.
He's your most famous singer from the land where you come from.
Yes, but don't expect me to understand cultural
and
references.
I'm not that wasn't Alanis Morissette, and it wasn't Men Without Hats. You don't know your music, do you at all?
No, unless it's classical music.
Can you name me any Canadian band of any sort?
How about Shania Twain?
So you like your country?
Okay, that's the only thing I can think of. Oh, Bare Naked Ladies. Yeah.
Have you not heard of? Did you never hear of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young?
Yeah, there seems to be one too many there.
And there's one of them. It comes from your country.
I wouldn't know.
Neil Young.
No.
I spent so much time listening to Neil Young.
Good for you.
In my
I'm
youth.
glad that my countrymen could provide entertainment for you. You know.
Although, and I've been through this before with another of your compatriots, Professor Tim Ball, who you must know well.
I've never actually met him, although we've communicated at various times over the years, but not too much.
He's a good man, and we discussed the issue of why it is that so many of the world's worst climate alarmists come from Canada. You think Maurice Strong, you think David Suzuki, your current president, is he? He's terrible. Trudeau?
President?
Prime Minister, whatever.
Yeah, some of us call him Prime Minister Zoolander.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you know, Canada was doing so well, and then suddenly it just kind of lost it completely again, didn't it? It sort of reverted to the mean, and the mean is kind of squishy, liberal.
Politics can be quite heartbreaking at times, can't it? Yes.
I bet, yeah. And the way that your country has been, I mean, I would have thought you quite value your open spaces in Canada. I mean, I've heard the Lumberjack song. I've seen the kind of, I've listened to Neil Young songs.
Now, see, I know the Lumberjack song.
But-
I know it, that's right.
So you are cultured, really. You are broadly cultured.
That kind of culture, yes.
So, what I'm leading to is here you've got a notoriously lovely country to live in, apart from the incredible bloody cold you have to put up with most of the year.
But that's nice too, in a way.
Well, for like skiing.
Cold. There's really nothing like walking out in really beautiful cold conditions with the fresh snow and the sun outside and sparkling on the surface of the snow and the quietness that comes from it. It's quite lovely.
Yes, no, I can see that. Why are some of your people carpeting your lovely country in enormous great wind turbines? I mean, how does that make any kind of sense?
Well, that's just part of the climate fervor, right? I mean, that's the wind turbine business. I don't really understand entirely why people are so convinced that this is something that I think they feel like they're getting something for nothing. Wind somehow
because it's
free
it's
energy, and so nothing. There's no dirty side to the design and construction of these massive objects, and there's no maintenance involved and everything else. And if people forget that there is maintenance involved and so forth, these things will probably stop working or burn down or whatever. I mean, so you still have to maintain them, and it costs money, and there's expenses associated. It's not so simple as people think.
Well, you were showing me earlier on a photograph of an icebreaker.
Yes.
Making its way through the ice to one of the more remote Canadian settlements, and I looked at the picture caption, and I was expecting October or January or something. This was in July.
Yes.
You had ice pack that needed breaking in July, so that villagers could be fed.
Yes. People, there's still ice in the Arctic. The world is as it should be.
So. Given that many Canadians have experienced great cold, why do they buy into this global warming thing so much?
Well, I find your style of questioning very, very jumpy. I kind of sort of leap from one thing. I was thinking, okay, now I'm going to say something about ice.
You can say what
now
you want.
I'm going to think about why Canadians buy into this. That's a whole different issue. So it's like I could tell you about the ice, or I can
tell you about the ice.
Okay, the ice is still there, and what people are seeing is what's happening at the winter or the summer minimum, and they have been observing changes in the surface area of ice at the summer minimum and observing that it had been going down, but in the winter the ice is all back. I mean, it's not like it's gone, and it swings around, so the summer minimum has been going up recently.
Yes.
And so forth. And the tendency or the desire with almost everything in global warming style is to think of things thermodynamically. So immediately people are talking about temperature. It's all about, the temperatures have gone up or temperatures have gone down. Has anyone actually gone and checked to see whether the temperatures have gone up and so forth? People don't think about it. They just think that the ice itself is a kind of thermometer, and ice is a really, really lousy thermometer. it's really a dynamical problem. There's a lot of dynamics going on, maybe thermodynamics, but there's this wind dynamics going on in the Barents Sea. And it has to do with whether ice gets jammed up against the coastline and how long it stays there. Basically, there's a kind of memory built into how ice forms and so forth. You change the dynamics a little bit, it will form in a different way. There's also issues with how ice is measured. I know when I've been in the Arctic, and I fly up over the seas there. Sometimes you can look down and it looks like it's open sea, but it turns out that in fact what it is it's a layer of water over ice. And so it could very easily be interpreted as open water, when in reality there's ice, and it's just so that there are all kinds of sources for error and misunderstanding in this respect. And I think it's a really dangerous thing to overinterpret this thing and try to connect it with a specific concept of climate and climate change and so forth. I think we live in a dynamical world. Things are happening on all time scales, on short time scales. You have the breeze going on outside, the trees swinging around and so forth on short time scales, and then on longer time scales of weeks, months, years, on continental time scales, and just in your backyard. All of the changes going on in all of these things all the time, and to simply attribute it to some sort of mean over global temperatures is very naive.
Yes, because we've heard a lot, haven't we,
Yes.
in newspapers like The Guardian and New York Times and CNN and so on, that many of the hottest years ever have been in the last, say, 20 years, which clearly is a sign that we are all warming the planet in a dangerous way because of our selfishness and greed, and we're all going to die. Now, I think you might possibly...
Oh my God, we're all going to die.
It's awful. It's so sad.
Yeah.
But you, I think, might dispute the possibility that we're even capable of calculating a global mean temperature.
Yeah, I'm kind of infamous in this respect. Many people know, in sort of meteorological groups know about me and my views on this thing. I actually was approached by a paper reading group of meteorologists, or at least some representative of it. And he said, "We read your paper on the non-existence of a global temperature, which my colleagues and I published in a thermodynamics journal, a journal of non-equilibrium thermodynamics." And they said, after careful study, we've decided that you're right. And but we can still use it as an index. That's what they think. And I said, yeah, I guess you can use it as an index. But one of the problems with using it as an index, I told them, was that when it goes up and down, you don't get to use the words warming and cooling. You can be indexing and de-indexing, but you can't say you're warming or cooling if it's just an index. But that's a kind of a long tangent, and it gets people all wound up, and I'm quite happy to play the role of the crazy uncle who thinks this crazy idea, and it doesn't bother me at all.
We were talking earlier about how science is being abused, and how really the whole climate change thing. I go every now and again to the Heartland Climate Conference, and I talk to a lot of these guys who are fantastic, very learned in their fields. But I think that they are under a slight illusion, which is that one day their good science will penetrate into the minds of the people, and that people will realise the error of their ways and come round. And my view is, no, this has never been about the science. This has always been about propaganda. This is just another manifestation of I suppose, the left's war on the values of Western civilization.
Well, I really like your watermelon metaphor. I think there's a lot of truth to this, but I think this is a really complicated sociological phenomenon, and it's happening at many levels. I think that there's a scientific level where there actually is something to talk about scientifically, And there is a political domain which is all itself very complicated and so on. And I do think that there are real sort of watermelon issues going on here. There's no doubt about that. But I do think that underneath there's a real science issue, and I think it gets obscured by these other things which are much louder and noisier and nastier and much more interesting to publish in newspapers for many people. Not so interesting for me. I find this stuff to be personally boring, but it's just part of our lives in that sense. I don't want to leave the impression. I think there are a lot of good scientists, people who have good intentions scientifically and are trying hard, but they're keeping their heads down because they don't really know what to make of this stuff. And I've seen many cases where some young, idealistic young academic goes into this field thinking that they're going to be free from any kind of political sort of interference and so on, and they end up having a rather rude awakening and being thrown into some kind of a tailspin. And I've seen a number of cases where people expect their mentors and so forth to behave in a clear and simple and rational scientific way, and then suddenly discover they're behaving like crazy people, and they don't know what to make of it, and it starts to compromise their careers and so on. So to young scientists, I recommend that you try to stay away from the hot button type issues until you've established yourself, or have a couple of crazy things to publish on the side, but have more routine and pedantic sorts of works that will be accepted, that becoming the basis of your career, and not the sort of wild adventurous stuff, which I'm privileged to be able to do in the later stage of my career. So.
But it's easier said than done, isn't it? Because there is so much funding now for the whole climate change thing. Like if you want to study grey squirrels' feeding habits, well, you're not going to get the funding.
Yeah,
but if you wanted,
I certainly wouldn't.
But if you wanted to,
funding for that.
Are you saying that probably there's somebody out there listening to this podcast thinking, hang on a second, I study grey squirrels' feeding habits as they're affected by climate change, and I can tell you it's just bloody amazing, and you should be interested in it.
Yeah,
Essex.
Yeah.
No, but you know what I'm saying, that people have to follow the money. Even scientists have got to eat. They can't just feed on the purity of their knowledge. And the way the funding mechanisms have gone, they've gone towards this. Well, it's what Myron Ebel calls the climate industrial complex.
Yeah, well, a lot of this is more modern than you might think. Before World War II, government funding for science was very minimal, if it even existed, and things like peer review and so forth really didn't exist either. And it was something that is sort of post World War II in many respects. I think the jury is still out on how well the concept of governments bankrolling research goes, and I think it's a very sort of checkered history, and not just in the question of climate. I think that climate is really drawing to our attention sort of some really much broader issues about how we fund science and how it's supported and so forth. I think it's something we ultimately need. We need people doing this kind of stuff.
What would you do? If you were dictator of the world, how would you get round the problem?
Me as dictator? What an interesting thought.
I think you'd be good. I think you'd be quite a benign.
You think I would be a benign dictator?
I think you would.
I don't know. I might become evil, I mean, I watch Lord of the Rings, so I know what to do,
That's true.
Yeah, I don't take the ring. I mean, I have to get rid of it, even though I want it.
Actually, that's a good point. Even, is it Galadriel? Or I think she puts on the ring, and even Galadriel becomes evil.
Yeah, so it is a problem, and I think that we do need our fellow human beings to kind of prevent us from kind of growing distorted, provide kind of clear boundaries on how to function.
But suppose you were, and I'm assuming you're going to be benign, how would you get around this problem that government, well, you and I know, because we're on the same side of the political argument, that when government tries to pick winners and when government tries to direct research, it always ends up directing it in the wrong direction.
Well, even more than that, it doesn't even realize it's doing it. So it means well, and so, okay, I'm going to keep you at arm's length. but it ends up not being really at arm's length. I mean, and I say that because I was on the board of the main funding agency in Canada.
Were you?
For 6 years.
So tell us some horror stories.
Well, the problem is that a lot of people in bureaucracies don't actually know what research is or what it's for. And so after a while, people come up with something they can live with. And one of the things they came up with is that somehow research is actually some kind of education. So the money should go to training graduate students so that the next generation learns about things at a high level, and not actually going to research. So it's a very confusing thing. Certainly in Canada, the Canadian Constitution calls for education to be handled by the provinces, but the federal government ends up funding education because they kind of think that that's sort of some kind of, sinecure that describes something that people can all support in terms of research. A lot of people don't think that, they don't realize just how little human beings know about nature, about the world that we live in, scientifically speaking. And so they find it very hard to imagine what research could be used for or how important it is. I think it's something that is tremendously important. It's really the long game of the generations. And it makes us, we're just kind of, we live with the light of 10,000 generations behind us. I mean, it's just amazing, this legacy, and I don't think any other animal is able to deliver this. So it's an amazing thing, and we have a way long road to go. And so we should keep doing this, but it's hard to put this into a day-to-day context that people can appreciate, because a lot of people don't know that we don't know everything anyway. People tend to think of humans as some sort of demigods, but we're just puny. We're just a candle in the wind compared to nature. I mean, in that sense.
I noticed in the run-up to Brexit that a lot of the very worst there's a type of scientist often lauded on Radio 4, worshipped by the BBC as their kind of friendly scientists who they quote at every...
The friendly scientist.
Yeah, whenever they can.
Friendly giant.
And these scientists aren't really...
Canadian reference.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. He's the big friend, the friendly giant to the north.
Yes. But there was a child's program in Canada called The Friendly Giant, and all Canadians know this program. With puppets and
we have Canadian listeners who are going to love the
they will know the reference.
They'll love you.
That's right.
It's going to be a very happy Canadian show. And before I got distracted, there's a certain kind of scientist who was very vocal during the Brexit campaign, saying, we are going to miss out on all this tremendous European Union funding, and science is going to suffer. And they're very into the idea that government is there to fund science, and science is so important. And yet, most of the best scientific discoveries seem to happen independent of government programs, don't they? I mean, you'll often hear the liberal left trying to say that it was thanks to government funding that the internet was invented. They talk about ARPANET or something like that, and they also try and claim that
which was military spending. That's right.
And they also try and tell us that of course NASA was justified, the space program was justified by the fact that Teflon was invented, so we can have non-stick.
Yeah, for me, you don't need to justify NASA.
No, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you've got horizontal fracking. Fracking was invented partly in government-funded laboratories. And when you look into the details, you find, no, this really wasn't the case. Actually, these things were developed by private scientists in much the same way as in the 19th century and before. Scientists were mostly rich dilettantes, weren't they? Discovering...
Yes, or they had some kind of rich sponsors. So,
isn't that how it should be?
Well, yes and no. I think that one of the things that we can say, and this comes back to your original question of what would I do if I was a dictator, I would identify. I mean, one of the things I found was there's always this need to justify research. Like, yeah, sure, you did all that stuff, but what have you done for us lately? I mean, that's the kind of attitude that you get treated with when you were trying to say, well, I'd like to do research on this exotic thing or that exotic thing. What good is that for the price of bananas? I mean, that's the kind of approach you take. So you have to justify your research, as if you're some kind of beggar coming to. But the reality is the reverse, and people don't comprehend this. That a lot of the things we have today are the result of a bunch of threadbare, impoverished, mathematicians and physicists and so forth who invented these things, which now have become and it's really totally amazing what this is. I mean, I can, for example, talk about the transistor as just a sort of an example. Now, of course, that was invented in Bell Labs, but you go back, there's all this sort of fundamental research that came up to make it possible for Bell Labs to do that. So, for example, if you were to create an independent corporation called Fundamental Research Incorporated, FRI, and all of these business groups who use these pure science inventions would have to pay a royalty on them. So it's a very small royalty on all the transistors that are ever made, for example. Or every transaction you do on the internet for banking, RSA encryption. Some mathematician generations ago was working on the theory of polynomials, something completely esoteric and of no apparent use. And now suddenly it has this value. So every time someone does a transaction, the bank pays a small amount to the FRI as a royalty. And then you can go through, and you soon discover that fundamental research ought to be the heir of a vast fortune, and they should be independently wealthy at this stage rather than beggars always begging for a little bit of extra cheese. They should be this independently wealthy organization, and because corporations have been using this human legacy to make themselves rich, but they haven't really been giving back, and then they're annoyed that they get taxes so that governments can then provide it. But if they paint it to an independent corporation, I think probably it might work a little bit better. And there's so many examples. Like, for example, general relativity. When I was a graduate student, that was like the ultimate in something that was true, but was of no practical use on a day-to-day basis. And then it turned out that you couldn't have GPS without accounting for general relativity. So at one time it was useless, and now it's a consumer item. I mean, it's something that there's so many things like that, and any one of them would make FRI completely wealthy, and it would be able to dole out fundamental research, and no government again would ever have to make decisions about what the winners and losers are. So that's my dictatorship solution.
Yeah, that's a very benign dictatorship solution. Can I point out at least one flaw in it?
Oh, I'm sure there are many.
FRI, you know what would happen. It would soon get populated, infiltrated by people who in another life would be working in government. Mm-hmm. And so you'd have diversity committees. Mm-hmm. They'd be paying millions for the diversity officers and trying to ensure that, for example, programs were split equally between female researchers and male researchers, and that
but that's the war against postmodernism, which is a whole different issue. I mean, it's identity politics and all that stuff, which is so tiresome.
I think we can talk about this in the next section. You are listening to me, your friend James Delingpole, on the Delingpole podcast with my very special guest, Dr. Christopher Essex.
Check out the official Breitbart store today. Store.breitbart.com is the home for the brand new official Breitbart store. Head there now for products for women and men, like t-shirts, baseball tees, tank tops, hoodies, and hats, or an unapologetically American belt buckle. Store.breitbart.com has these items and many more, so get your gear now at store.breitbart.com. This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to Delingpole, the podcast with me, your friend, James Delingpole, and my special guest, Dr. Christopher Essex. Actually, I was going to talk about post-normal science and about how post-modernity has infected even science. But you've just shown me something that's really annoyed me. You've brought with you a copy of The Economist, or the E-Communist, as I call it.
The E-Communist.
Which has got an article in it called "Skating on Thin Ice," and it's about how it says.
That's quite clever, don't you think? They did a good job. They probably thought for a while about that. Yes, it was very clever.
Yeah.
Yes.
Efforts to limit global warming will not stop the Arctic melting. And so there's a long screed about how, the Arctic's melting and it's all awful. The Economist is read by some very serious people, isn't it? It's the Bible of the kind of Eurocrat Davos man elite. People in New York read it.
I don't.
Why have you got it with you? You paid £5 for it.
I did. I had to get rid of some UK change, which I had accumulated. I saw that and I thought, okay, well, I'll show that to people as an example. But otherwise, I wouldn't.
But this is what we're up against. Yeah. As a journalist, it really annoys me, actually, because some of my friends work for The Economist and they get paid really, really well. It's one of those few areas in journalism where you can earn
good
a really...
For them.
Yeah. It's like... It is a bit like going to work for the EU, actually. If you buy into the whole system, you are rewarded for it with tenure. And they have a great life. And they have this weird tradition where they don't sign their articles. So it has.
I noticed that the one article that really I thought was rather off-putting was not signed at all, and polar bear, and it's all the usual, and the standard thermodynamic fallacy of using thermal arguments for a dynamical system, which is sort of classical stuff, and they try to use hand-waving arguments as to why you expect.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Let's just read the stand first. The Arctic, as it is known today, is almost certainly gone. Now, if this was kind of Crapsville Weekly, some sort of free sheet that you got given out in Tesco, that would be fine. But this is The Economist telling you this stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that just means that you should be skeptical of what human beings say. Humans are kind of switchy that way. I mean, you have to just watch them carefully.
Post-modernity. I think if we're talking about one of the problems with the average person out there and the way that they look at science, they imagine that there are artists, people like me, who read worthless degrees like English literature and just read lots of books and really don't know anything about stuff because it's a soft science. It's not a STEM subject. And then people think, STEM subject.
I see.
STEM, clever people, because science is pure. Science is about the quest for truth. There is no relativism involved. But you're going to correct me on this, aren't you? That postmodernity.
I haven't decided which part I'm going to correct you on. So, okay.
Postmodernism in science. It's in there, isn't it? It's rotting it.
Depends on which part of science you're talking about, I think. If you're talking about more of the hard science part of it, I think generally it's been pretty good at resisting that kind of thing. And
has it?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, it's got its problems, but we see this as kind of some kind of fireworks going on the other island someplace. And
actually, I can imagine applied maths, for example. How would you feminize that or
they try. And one of the things I think that I find happens in course requirements is that rather than it's really hard to kind of soften that stuff down. You can do anything you want, but I mean, it's harder to do it. And so one of the ways in which they do it is they just reduce the number of courses you have to take in that field. Like they reduce the requirements, the math requirements. I mean, that's sort of one of the ways in which they get around that.
Is this to try and attract more of the people who wouldn't otherwise read maths?
Well, I think there are certain topics that require a lot of effort in order to succeed at, and mathematics is one of them for sure, and physics. You have to practice it the way people practice musical scales or languages and so forth. You have to practice these things, and the more you practice, the better you get at it. And some people aren't prepared to put the effort in, and so it becomes hard for them. I think a lot of people are actually more capable of doing this than they realize. I've had experiences where I've worked with students and I've been able to get the students who didn't think they were so good at it to do much better than they imagined they could. So I think there's something to be said for that.
But so is it a bit like the military where they've dropped the fitness standards to get more women in and more?
No, I mean, I think there's a much more than the sort of identity politics side of it. I think that there's a tremendous, the way in which a lot of things are incentivized money-wise is inconsistent with the academic goals. So there's the competition to get students tends to invite a process of making it easier on the students, and so there's a pressure, and that maybe is something that is kind of subliminal because it's something that takes place over many generations, and there's a lot to be said about that.
But do you get that problem as a professor? Do you find yourself in a situation now where the snowflakes in your charge, maybe you don't have snowflakes on maths courses, but the students?
I've got some pretty good students. I teach mathematics to advanced students and to engineers and so on, and so they're pretty solid in a lot of ways. I mean, I get some really good, determined students, some of the best anywhere.
But you must see other departments which are falling prey to this.
Oh yeah, but I mean, postmodernism, all that stuff, critical theory and so forth. I only know about that because I've kind of ended up having to interact on this sort of this broader issue of climate and everything else. It was probably the one area where all of this gets driven in, and but generally I can avoid a lot of that stuff if I want to.
Well, you and I are both in the same boat, I think, in that. Do you know what? If I could wave a magic wand and get the last 15 years of my life back, I would rather. Do you know that awful phone? My daughter programmed the entertainer onto the phone.
It's very nice.
No, it's bloody maddening, but we don't know how to change it.
Oh, I might be able to help you with that. I don't know. It looks familiar anyway.
It's really annoying.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, what was I saying?
Similar 15 years back. Yeah. Get the last 15 years.
How is that important? Have I got a? No. How important is this? Is it an American interview? Yeah, okay. Apparently not that important. It's not work, and it's not money. So.
Oh, I see. That's important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm a jobbing freelancer. Yeah. Oh, if I could wave my wand and have the last 15 years of my life back, and avoid all that kind of vilification and all the. I mean, I've developed a thick skin. But it hasn't been nice. It hasn't really been.
It wears on
I've
you
met
after
some
a
good
while.
people, but
Yeah.
it's been horrible. Actually, it's taken its toll.
Yeah.
Why do we do it? Why did you do it? What made you leave the ivory tower of advanced mathematics? Because you didn't need to engage with this stuff, and yet you've come down and what's your title at the GWPF? I'm
the chairman of.
You're the chairman
of the Academic Advisory Council
of the Global Warming Policy Foundation.
Yes.
So you are on the front line now, fighting the fight. You're probably despised by so many academics, aren't you?
I don't know. I'm sure
Yes, they hate you.
They hate me.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. Well, look. I mean, people can form their own opinions. I mean, I think there's a whole area of philosophy called Stoicism where you realize there are certain things you can't control, and the opinions of other people are in that category, and you just try to say, well, that's just life. As to why I would do this, well, that's I think a complicated question. I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer it in full here, but I think what it comes down to is that I really care about what's true, and I really care about the importance of rational thinking, the Enlightenment to humanity, and I want the best for my fellow human beings. I want the best for my children and grandchildren. I want the future to be great, and I feel that's one of the ways in which we as human beings, contribute, achieve some measure of immortality is by taking what we have learned, adding to it, and passing it on to our children so that they can survive.
Well, I'm totally with you on this, and yet it seems to me that large swathes of academe have been hijacked by people who are... You've got tenured professors who are, in my view, thick as pig shit. They should not be teaching. They should not be teaching undergraduates. There was, for example, I was listening to Radio 4, BBC Radio 4 the other day, and there was a program about language, an amiable language program, which obviously I find interesting, being an English literature graduate, and they had on this professor from Berkeley, and he was talking about how the alt-right has created this new language of words like cuck and snowflake. And this guy was so nakedly left-wing, he really shouldn't have been on a allegedly neutral radio program without balancing voices. And B, what he was saying was so far off beam from reality. It was not intellectually rigorous. And you'd have thought that if you're a professor at a named university like Berkeley, you ought at least, as a bare minimum requirement for your job, to have intellectual rigor. What's happened?
Well, I keep thinking of this scene in the movie Apocalypse Now.
Oh, I love that film. Which one? Saigon shit.
Yeah,
no.
when recriminations about some wrongful deaths take place, and the line is, complaining about that is like handing out speeding tickets at the Indianapolis 500, and I find that human thinking is often so wonky, and I don't mean just other people. I mean sometimes my own. I mean I have to really be suspicious of my own thinking a lot. That when you observe someone behaving like a crazy person, it's really, kind of par for the course, and, you shouldn't be too upset about it. That's just the way humans are,
But do you think that...
they could do better. I mean, I agree with you.
Yeah, could do better.
That's right. But I see this there's so many things that people do wrong that I can see in all of the applications I deal with. There's so many defective aspects of how people reason about certain things. And I'm more than aware that it's easier to see the flaws in the reasoning of other people than in your own reasoning, right? I mean, so that's something I'm very suspicious of my own flaws in this respect. But yeah.
For example, I'll bet if you went into most colleges, any college almost anywhere in the world, and you asked people about truth, they would say that this was a relative concept.
Yeah, I know. I that's really sad, isn't it?
Well, it's sad that students think this way, but it's even sadder that the people teaching them also think this way. There are so many branches now which are based on this kind of form of relativism.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there have been defective ideas throughout the ages of one kind or another, and it would penetrate the whole societies from top to bottom. And the idea that there isn't, that all truth is relative and so forth, and then they even point to relativity, which has some of the most absolute things in it of any theory, like the speed of light, for example. I mean, it's sort of so crazy. I mean, they use that as a model to justify their relativism. So it's a kind of it's kind of almost a joke of Einstein, this idea of calling it relative. But anyway, I don't want to sound too mellow about all of this stuff, but because it does get on my nerves. But as a self-defense mechanism, I see it an awful lot, and I do want to have a life, so I don't want to think about it all the time. I have to kind of close my eyes off from it and put my fingers in my ears because it irritates me to do this, to listen to that stuff.
But isn't the danger that I mean, I've got kids approaching university age, and it worries me that increasingly, if you equip a child to understand that truth is not relative, if you give them the basic historical facts, if you teach them to question some of the received ideas of our time, what you're actually doing is setting them up for a fall, because they're going to enter this environment where groupthink is now so oppressive that to think outside
beware of fashion.
Yeah.
Beware of fashion. And I don't just mean fashion in clothing. and fashion in whether you put rings through your nose or dye your hair blue or something, that kind of fashion. But beware of fashion in thinking. And there is such a thing as fashion in thought. And one of the signatures of science, and we were talking about scientific method, one of the signature features of science is that in order to make progress in science, you end up challenging these fashions. And so you see the history of science is littered with people who were challenging fashion, automatically find themselves on the outside, and these kind of lonely figures who are sort of fighting against some kind of orthodoxy. And I think people should take lessons like that to heart, and when they go to a place where everyone thinks a certain way, they should be aware that sometimes you have to be the lone person standing against the tide. And of course, when I came to visit the UK, one of the reasons why I came was to remember a colleague at Oxford, Leslie Woods. He was a mathematician there, and he wrote an autobiography called Against the Tide, and he was kind of the signature maverick, and he even gave me maverick lessons as a young man. He kind of pulled me aside and gave me maverick lessons.
Did he? What go on, tell me, what did they involve?
Well, I mean, basically knowing that, when you have to make some kind of a choice when you start your career. I mean, you've got sort of two options, and when it comes to dealing with humans, I mean, one is that you can kind of go along with the crowd, and then you can get recognition and honors and so forth, and you can also buck the crowd, buck the convention, and that's where you actually have to be guided by the thing itself and not what the social norms are. And so if you're trying to pursue a career in the thing, as a science or whatever, then you actually have to be guided by the science itself and not pay attention to the wider cultural context and so forth. And what you'll find is you'll have a whole lot more fun, a whole much bigger adventure, but you won't get the recognition and so forth. And you'll often be clashing with the convention. But I think it's a respected tradition in the scientific world and the academic world to some extent too, in the wider sense, and to kind of, maybe not be destructive, but I mean, at least to try to kind of steer into the wind a little bit away from the fashion. And you'll have a much more interesting life. And I certainly I've made real scientific discoveries in my career, which haven't been lionized, and I don't care. I mean, it's never really is important to me. But I know that I've done some really cool things, and I've really enjoyed my career in that sense. But when you go that route, you've gone against what people expect, and so that's one of the things I think. I mean, sort of less implied in many respects. He was an interesting fellow. He was a fighter pilot in World War II, then became a mathematician, right? I mean, he flew over 70 missions. And
did he? What did he fly? Do you know?
I think he flew Corsairs, but
so he's American.
No, he's a New Zealander.
Okay,
he was a New Zealander, and some of us in the non-American groups got American equipment and so forth. So I think the last Canadian to die in World War II was a guy flying a Corsair. So off a Royal Navy aircraft carrier, in fact, I understand. So,
well, how lucky you were to have that man teaching you, because otherwise you might have gone in a very different direction.
Well, I don't know if I would have gone it, but it was really nice to have somebody suggest that this was actually a legitimate thing to do. That it was actually a good thing to do, to actually buck the trends. Now, as I said, I don't mean buck your trends to blow everything up. I mean, like some kind of postmodern nihilist and burn everything down, that sort of thing. But you often can see that you become more creative when you do the more challenging thing.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have no restrictions, then often you just become complacent. You need the conflict and the constraints and to actually come up with really original stuff. So it's kind of helpful in that respect. But you'll often find yourself in conflict with the people who followed the convention. I mean, and I've I can cite examples, I won't do that here, but of specific cases where, it became very clear that I've chosen to be on the outside of the window looking in. I mean, so.
I hope that people listening to this program who are, you young friend, if you are of university age, I hope you're listening to Professor Essex and taking this advice, because I think it's really good. Thank you so much for an interesting podcast. You were listening to me, your friend, James Delingpole, talking to Dr. Christopher Essex on the Delingpole podcast, brought to you by Breitbart. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.